All right. Happy Monday, Warriors. Good to see y'all. At least it's good to see some black screens out there. Hopefully those will go away. I can see your nice Warrior faces, that you're all doing well. On the screen is our map check, what we're going to get going today. Here we are on the 27th of April. And today we're going to get into one of my favorite topics. Of course, they're all my favorite topics, is lean, which is just exciting stuff and worth a lot of money out there in the real world if you start to even take an interest to it. On Wednesday, we'll go over total quality management, which is also very marketable out there in the world, regardless of whether you're into marketing or accounting or any other walk of life. Entrepreneurship, total quality management, you say that to folks, they know what it means. And so that means money. Let me just get past my technical difficulties. All right, super. Going ahead, looking ahead to next week. This time next Monday, we won't have a Zoom. Just to be clear, we will have Zoom twice this week, once today and then on Wednesday. And then that takes us to next Monday, a week from now. We will not have a Zoom. We will have a Canvas quiz. Be a little bit bigger because we'll be covering two topics. Probably have some scenarios in there. I'll make the adjustments in terms of time, and I'll give you more information on that. This time, or Wednesday of next week, that's the 6th of May, we'll go through our final exam prep. So look a lot like our previous preps. We'll play some Kahoot. We'll get your questions ahead of time, what you'd like me to cover again and review, and we'll do that thing. We'll also take a class photo on that day, and we'll do it over Zoom, so that'll be unique, and so that we'll have that, so that 40 years from now you go, yeah, I was in this group with this person, and I can remember their name, that kind of stuff. Anyway, on the 8th of May, I will post your assessments on class interaction and participation. That's a possible 50 points for the course. And then this is just updated. Some Warriors like a little bit of reading day love, one more repetition or so on material that maybe they're having problems with or difficulty with at the last minute. I just want to be clear, this is not a requirement. Reading day is designed for you to get organized and prep for combat, and how you spend that is your decision. But if you want to get some last minute love from me in terms of a topic or any topic throughout the course, then you can go ahead and sign up for a 30-minute block if you want to. I'm going to do that starting at 9 o'clock that morning. I'm going to cut it off at 12, get a little break in, and then do it again from 1 to 3. So whatever the math is there, I guess that works out to be, I don't know, more than a handful of slots. If you want it, just email me. If you don't, that's okay too. I'm not keeping a black book on who does that. And then on the 13th of May, we'll have our final. We'll talk much more about that between now and then. Our final schedule between 3 and 5. If anything, I'll give you more time than that, and obviously not less. Okay, so that's our map check. Any questions on the map check? All right, super. Moving right along. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about lean. I'm already recording this. Here's our agenda for lean. What resources you have available through YCP to learn more about lean, the overall purpose of lean, a little bit of history, and then we get into the technical aspects, push versus pull production, how we determine profit with the lean approach, and then 6 areas we want to focus on with lean. And again, all this information, well, I would say 95% of it is out of Chapter 10. What is not out of Chapter 10, and there's some in here that is not out of Chapter 10, is just out of conversations I've had with Dr. Greisler and just professional knowledge. So one more thing I want to say just briefly and make it brief before I keep going with today is I want to talk about class participation a little bit. Again, we had a model before we went into our current configuration of being online. I've had to make some adjustments. I've published my philosophy and standards on those adjustments. Just to be clear, to earn participation points, You pretty much got to come to class, whether it's a Zoom session or something else. The second thing, my expectation is if you've got a video camera, I expect it to be on, meaning I expect to see you. For reasons I won't go into, if you've got a black screen up with your name on it, that just doesn't do it for me. Now, I
Sir,
don't.
Mr. Jackson, I don't have a webcam, sir. I'm sorry.
Okay. I appreciate you bringing that up. So I was getting to that. If you don't have a webcam, you can come up on the net like Vicus just did, or you can email me point to point and let me know you don't have a webcam. That's perfectly fine. I don't expect folks to run out and buy something that they don't have just for this. But I just want to be clear, in the absence of knowing that, human beings tend to gravitate towards assumptions. Okay. So if you have technical difficulties, if you have limitations, if you don't have a microphone, again, just reach out and let me know. Otherwise, turn your stuff on. And it's good to see you all popping up. I always like seeing you. To me, that's kind of half the point of this. Okay. Does that answer your question, Vicus?
So, you're not going to take any points off for not having a webcam, right?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. I'll drop down and give you 10. How about that?
If that's what you feel like doing, Vicus, you can get your 10 on.
Okay.
But no, I'm not going to quote take any points away. I don't wake up in the morning to take points away. I wake up in the morning to give you the best product you can possibly get. And to me, that begins with you being present and engaged. And I know sometimes these overviews kind of seem like a one-way thing. I try to make them as entertaining as possible. So if you have limitations or things like that, and you don't want to talk about them in an open forum, just reach out to me on an email, and just so I'm aware of what we're working with. Okay. Just to be clear on that. If you have any questions at all on that, please get hold of me. If you want to know where you stand, please get hold of me, those kind of things. Okay. That's all I want to say about that right now. And with that, we will get into the meat and potatoes of today, which is lean. All right, not necessarily the Michael Jackson lean. I always thought this was pretty cool how he did this. I actually thought for a long time that him and all his crew were doing this just out of sheer athletic prowess alone. And then I found out one day, kind of bummed me out. It's like finding out that Santa Claus isn't real. I found out that he had magnets in his shoes, and they all did. Still, I think it's pretty cool. But, that's not the lean we're going to talk about today. Here's our agenda, which is the same thing we just saw. And if you like any part of what we're talking about today, I just want to preview with a couple points. Number one, the book on the left, Lean Production Simplified, is really a fantastic book. It's easy to read. It's very friendly. It's very practitioner focused. I got a lot out of reading this book, even more than reading our current text. Um, a lot of things that were not clear to me prior to reading this book became clear when I did. I am not by any means an expert on lean, but this made things a lot clearer for me. Now, the second thing is, how I got to that was through one of my colleagues, Dr. Greisler. So if you haven't met Dr. Greisler, of course, obviously now it's kind of difficult to meet anybody, but someday over the rainbow, when we all get to see each other again in person, he is just someone you've got to meet, big or small, whether you're interested in lean or not. He's been really an institution at York College. He's been at York College for, I want to say this is his 17th year. Prior to being at York College, he spent 22 years as the chief operations officer at WellSpan. So really a wealth of knowledge in the healthcare industry and operations. And he is the guy he is really our guru on lean. He teaches a class, Supply Chain 320, on lean. It's only offered in the fall. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, Really, he is the guy that I would point you to. And he's just a great guy in general. Okay, so on to lean. Now, why do we talk about lean? Well, first, its overall purpose. It's really a great way to start to bring this course to an end because the course is called Value Chain. And we really talk about the components of the value chain, but lean and total quality management, for that matter, really bring all this stuff together. And so the overall purpose is increasing value to the customer while reducing waste and preserving quality. So this seems very simple, um, but I think it's worth spending a couple more seconds on that. So when you look at each one of these, it's relatively not hard to increase value to the customer, but to do all three of these things at the same time becomes more and more difficult because increasing value to the customer by itself actually might incur cost. All right. So, for example, I want to develop a better product for the customer, something that's more durable. Well, that might come out of my operating costs to go from a mug that keeps things at 39 degrees to a mug that keeps things at 32 degrees. That's probably going to cost more. And what I could do is just pass that cost off to the customer. We'll see in a moment that lean does not believe in that. Okay, so increasing value while reducing waste and preserving quality is really this kind of Rubik's Cube of things that's a little bit harder to do than meets the eye. Okay, so reducing waste is very much seen as the road to reducing cost and making savings, but they purposely do not put reducing cost in here because that implies doing things on the cheap, and that would compromise preserving quality. So we'll see that throughout this, various ways to get after this. But if you remember one thing about lean, it's about these three things right here. Okay. So with that, um, first a footnote, lean, and the book describes it in several different ways. I think lean is most commonly used in production. But it could also be used in terms of operations from a service perspective and also in terms of logistics. But I think most commonly you'll find lean discussed and practiced in production. So Harley Davidson, Motorola, um, big volume kind of efforts. And like we talked about with product life cycle, when we're in a birth phase or a growth phase is probably not the time to implement lean. And Dr. Greisler and I have had some discussions on this because during the birth and the growth phase, there's so much more uncertainty about demand, about the voice of the customer, and those types of things that implementing lean during these times would probably be premature. So we don't really want to do that then. But once we get our idea of what demand is going to be, then, and demand has kind of stabilized for the most part, during that maturity phase, that's really when we should be going after things like lean, because then we could really get after increasing value while reducing waste. And that's probably a prime time to identify the waste we've accumulated in production processes to that point. So the main footnote is lean is most commonly implemented in production type environments. And on that note, let's look at a little bit of history of lean. I really like the story of Taichi Ono because I think Taichi Ono really has contributed so much to the lean philosophy and way of life. And really, when you read about him, it's really an amazing life, an amazing legacy. So prior to Taichi Ono, we to really understand Taichi Ono's contributions, knowing that lean is very much practiced today. We go back to the end of World War II and really the post Japan era of post post Japan, prior after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So between 46 and 1950. And so you can imagine the state that Japan was in at this time, recovering from being bombed by twice by the United States, and they were in this Great Depression, and really trying to find their way out of that. And Taichi Ono was the chief production officer for Toyota. He, I'm going to mess up the pronunciation, but you see it there on the screen. I think it's Ijai Toyota. So Toyota really was the CEO, and Taichi Ono was his chief production officer. Well, around this time, Ford was the man in the United States. And Ford is known for this quote, you can have any color car you want as long as it's black, which I love this quote because it really personifies the idea behind mass industrialization, which was this idea that, hey, if you don't like the way we're doing things, then you can be without a car. Ford literally was in the driver's seat. He could produce all day long, and the demand in the United States was there. And Ford didn't really have to worry about whether people could afford a car or not, or whether they didn't like it, because for every person who didn't like his car, there was probably tens and 20s and 30s and hundreds of people that did and wanted one. So Ford was really in the driver's seat. Well, the story is that Taichi Ono and Toyota probably traveled to the United States at some point during this post-World War II depression to see Ford's operation and how he did business. And I can only imagine that they went back to Japan and were probably sitting there drinking a beer, and Ono looked Toyota in the face and he said, "We cannot do business the same way that Ford does. You need to understand this." And Toyota said, "Well, what do you mean? I mean, Ford's making mad money. He's producing cars. I mean, what do you mean we can't do business like that?" And Ono said, "There's no way we can do business like that. We will be out of business. We have to change some elements of production. We cannot do, but regardless, we cannot do things like Ford." And so what Ono and Toyota said, "How are you going to do this?" And I can only imagine that back then Ono probably still said, "Hold my beer and watch me." And so Ono, he attacked all these things that people believed you could not do at that time. And some of those things are right here. So one of the first things that Ono did was that he empowered even the lowest level of worker on the assembly line. He not only said you are important, he put systems in place that are still practiced by Toyota and other companies today. So he went down the line and he said, "Hey, if any of you see anything wrong during production, I want you to stop production." And this is actually practiced. Again, this is called the TPS, the Toyota Production System, and still do it today. So think about this. You're newly hired. Jacob's first day on the job, he barely knows how to spell Toyota. And he sees some windshield coming through that's all jacked up. Jacob can hit a bell and stop production on his very first day. Now, the life I lived before this, there was no way that would happen. There's no way that a private could say, "Hey, there's something wrong here." He would just get yelled all day long. So very different culture, and a very different culture at the time. Another thing Ono did was he said, "We cannot have huge machines that do only one thing. We have to have machines that can do 2 things, 4 things, 5 things, 6 things. He said, we will go broke. We don't have the money to buy these huge one-trick ponies. And furthermore, because when you buy this machine that does one thing, you're assuming that everybody is always going to want that one thing that machine does. We have to be a lot more flexible than that. So he not only invented or invested in machines that can do more than one thing. That's the multifunctional bit. He invented them. So he looked at dies and punches and things like that. And he said, why do we have this machine that can only punch through metal one way? And we need to be able to change that die like in seconds and fractions of a second so that we can change on a dime and produce different types of cars. And so he was instrumental in doing that. The Ford model was when you do a production run, you're going to produce like 5,000 cars at a time. And Ono said, we can't do that. We could produce 5,000 cars and probably 2,500 of them would sit there in the lot for weeks, taking up space. And that would be wasteful. And again, we would go out of business doing that. So Ono said, we need to be able to produce in small batches. If the demand is 500, we need to produce 500 at a time. If a demand for a different type of car emerges, we need to be able to respond to that demand. Because part of the issue in Japan was what people could afford. Ford never had to worry about that. He's like, I don't care if you can afford it or not. Somebody out there is going to be able to afford it just by sheer numbers. But Japan was not in that situation. And then finally putting the focus on the customer. And Ono, again, he treated his workers as if they were his customer. And he said, we need to have people working for Toyota for like 30 years. And to do that, we need to pay them right. We need to value their opinion. So as we talk about Ono, he really got into the details. And so you might think that he was a micromanager. People loved this guy because the way that he treated people. And he also wasn't a guy who sat up in his office and you had to go see him. He was out on the shop floor and he would constantly be observing. They actually call this Gemba. And the Gemba is the idea that the production line, the shop floor is where the action happens. And so if you want to solve problems, you need to be out in the Gemba, observing, watching what's happening and thinking. And that's what he would do. So he knew everybody. He knew everybody by their first name. He knew where they were from. He knew a lot about their family. And he made sure everybody was taken care of. And they took care of him. And people just wrote on and on. They loved this dude. So throughout today, one thing I want you to think about is, and we're going to carry this forward into our quizzes and our exam. When you see something, you got to think about, from a lean perspective, what would Ono say? So for example, if you saw the phrase produce in large production runs or large batches, would Ono say oh to that, like he's very excited and for it? Or would he say, no, that's not a good idea? Okay, with that specific example, he would say, that's not a good idea. That's a very wasteful idea. So it's kind of like true or false, oh or no. Think about that in your back of your mind as you think about lean. Now, one of the things about lean right off the bat is this idea of push versus pull. Okay, so this goes hand in hand with capacity. And when you see here on the left, we have a push system. And in a push system, we produce upon a set schedule. So we just push those orders into the system. And so with this example here on the left, actually, let me fire up my drawing pad so I can add on to this. Okay, so with this example right here, Let's say I push 400 items into the system. Let's say this production line is producing cars. So I produce 400 items into the system, and these are each stations, A, B, and C. So A has a capacity of 400 cars, no problem. Those 400 orders go in and then they come out. But B only has a capacity of 300. Well, what's going to happen is there's going to be some buildup before station B because they can't process these 400 cars at an even rate. Okay. And we call this buildup right here. And we'll talk more about this. It's actually called queue buildup. Okay. And you all have experienced some sort of queue in your life, whether it was waiting in line for a rock concert, waiting in line to get a haircut. That's what happens is you have a demand in the system, waiting in line to get Starbucks. That's all queue buildup. And sometimes it's unavoidable. But in this system, it probably could be avoided by doing a pull system. So the difference in pull is that instead of just upon a set schedule, you produce when it's necessary and you produce based on the capacity of the system. So let's say we had the same system here with A, B, and C. Under the second system, even though they can move 300 through, and even though A could move 400 through, we would only have them move 200 through at a time. But really, the pull part is when these guys move something out, we put 200 in. And so in the pull system, it's all very smooth, assuming that everybody is operating at their capacity. So every time 200 leaves, 200 moves to the right each station. And that 200 just like a clock. Boom. Everything moves at the same time. Boom. Everything moves at the same time. There's no queue buildup like there is here. You can see any other errors as they happen. Here, what happens with this is with this queue buildup, the people working here at B, they get really stressed out because they can work as hard as they want to work, and this pile is just going to keep on growing. So after a while, they start making errors because they're trying to rush things through and try to knock this pile down. Okay. So the problem, a lot of the problem is that we're pushing items into this system when we should based on a schedule, when we should be pulling them in based on capacity. Okay. And you see good systems have done this. Registration for colleges or for classes is probably essentially a pull system. Somebody has done the analysis and said, hey, the internet can only handle, or the server can only handle this many people registering at a time. So we regulate when folks can sign up for classes. It's not the best example, but it is an example of a pull system. All right, moving along. This is how we determine profit based on a lean approach. And again, this is something that probably originated with Ono. And looking at this right away, it looks kind of deceiving. And so, again, it's worth slowing down a little bit and making sure that we understand it. And I'm just going to get my pen up for this. So really under the way we say pre-lean, but also companies that are not employing lean practices. Remember, the purpose of lean is to reduce waste and hold costs down. If we can't reduce waste, we want to keep costs down and not pass on costs to the customer. Well, under companies either before lean, before Ono, or companies today that are not practicing lean, here's what happens. So let's just play with some numbers. Let's talk about this equation. So under those companies, they figure out what it costs them to make something. Okay, let's say I don't know, pick an item, they make coffee makers. And it costs them $600 to whatever, make coffee makers in a month. Okay. And let's say they want to make $100 on top of that cost. Okay. So the steps are they first determine what it's going to cost them to make something. And then they determine how much profit they want to make above that. Okay. And so then the third thing would be the price they're going to charge to the customer. So let's say you got, coffee makers and they've got a customer out here. Maybe they got a number of customers that work in the restaurant industry or something like that, or retail. And so they're going to charge these folks 700, and that will cover their operating costs, and they'll get $100 on top of that. Okay. What's wrong with that? Seems like it makes sense. Well, actually, in reality, this is a little bit counterintuitive to what's really going on in the world. Let me give you an example. So the tour that we were going to take that we didn't because of quarantine and all those kind of things, York Corrugating. So York Corrugating, what they do is they make heating, air conditioning. They do a lot of work with metal. They take steel as their raw material and they convert it into metal things. They also do fenders for fire trucks, which I thought was really pretty cool. But their main business is heating and air. They also do elevator parts and things like that. So one of the things, Brad Little is the chief production officer down there. And he told me that they get by on repeat customers. So they'll have the same customers that they make metal objects or metal fixtures and, things for, that'll buy from them year after year after year. And one of the things that happened to your corrugating is the tariffs on steel and importing steel. So their cost actually went up. All right. So down here, so when their cost went up, they thought, well, maybe we could just pass the cost to our customer. But the problem is the customers that they've had, because they've been with them for so long, actually want the opposite. So if I'm your customer for 5 years running, eventually I'm going to say, hey, Nick, you need to give me a discount because I've been buying from you for so long. And that's what Brad was experiencing. He found that he just couldn't pass off the cost to the customer. Okay, because that's what happens in this model up here. So let's say that cost increases, like at York Corrugating, from 600 to 700. Okay. Well, under the same model, if I still want to make $100 profit off of that, I'm just going to pass that increase off to the customer. See what I did there? Okay. I keep my 100. This goes up, but because of this equation, I just pass it off to the customer in my price. I go, hey, man, steel prices went up for me, so they're going to go up for you. Sorry, Charlie. That's just the way the world works. Well, in Brad's case, he couldn't do that. Folks are like, I got it. It sucks that steel prices went up for you, but I've been with you for 5 years. I could have gone with some other corrugating company, but I continued to choose you, but you haven't given me a discount throughout that time. So the lean model is that we don't pass that increase off to the customer. And the way that we do that is we approach this differently. So I just want everybody to make sure they understand that this equation in the red is the same equation as the green. We just made a few modifications. One of the modifications we made is that instead of the price being the last thing that we determine, so in other words, it's not fixed, price down here under the lean method is the first thing that we determine. Okay. So let's go back to these blue. All right. And say that price is 700. Okay. And then we determine how much it's going to cost us, which would be the second thing. And using these blue numbers, we would say, well, that cost is 600. And so profit is the last thing that we determine. And it's another way of saying that under this lean model is profit is anything that's left over. Okay. Well, let's look what happens under this model when things increase. All right. So if our cost goes up under this model here, we can't pass it here because this is fixed. So if our cost for some reason goes up, we don't make any money. We don't make any profit. And what this model does is the only way you're going to make profit is you have to reduce that cost. Okay. Even under right here, if I want to make more than 100, I can't raise this price because it's fixed. So if I want to make more than that 100, I need to reduce costs down to 500, 400, 300, et cetera. And you might say, well, how do I do that if the steel industry is raising their prices? If my supplier is raising prices, how do I? So if my supplier is raising their price, how do I deal with that? Well, I have to drive down my cost. Okay. And that's what we do during lean. So how do you drive down costs? Well, there's a number of ways. And these are some of the ways right here. Okay. Eliminating waste. Ono was, again, that's one of the 3 parts of lean was reducing waste. So he actually defined waste in a number of ways. And then as well as maintaining a broad view, employing simplicity, continuous improvement, visibility, and flexibility. So we'll talk about all these. Let's talk about waste first. Come on, computer. There we go. So Ono, and I've seen this acronym in different ways. I've seen this reordered to make some acronyms. I'm just going to talk about it top to bottom. So we talked about push versus pull, and that goes hand in hand with overproduction. So Ono was not a fan of overproduction, quite the opposite. He believed in just producing what you need. And his mantra was produce in small batches. And ideally, if you can produce in a lot of one, meaning, hey, we need a red car. Can you produce a red car? He felt that, well, we might as well go ahead and produce 500 red cars because our costs work out. He was like, no, we need to work it out. So if we want to produce a lot of one, we should be able to do that because overproduction usually prompts more inventory that we don't need, more space that we don't need, potentially more labor and more fixed costs. So he was not a fan of overproduction at all. Waiting queues and items in waiting, he felt was wasteful. Like we talked about earlier, we had that system where there was that queue buildup going on between stations. And his thought process was all this stuff is just sitting there and it could be moving out, but it's not. And so that is wasteful. And if that's causing people to make errors, that's even more wasteful. So I would rather have things move through evenly, error free with quality than have this queue build up. And additionally, while it's waiting, nothing is happening towards it. So something is uneven here. This is wasteful. This should say, really, when you talk about wasteful motion. So here we're talking about people doing things that moving in ways that was wasteful. So I read one from, I think, Ono's autobiography or something he had personally written, where he watched somebody operate, and he just watched this person all day, and he saw that this person had some tools at their station, but then throughout the day, they would walk across the room to another workstation or a tool bench and get some tools and then come back and do some things. And so they spent a lot of time walking back and forth across the shop floor. And he had a hard time with that. His thought was, your activity and your job should be metriced out so that you have to move as little as possible. And that way you can output a lot more. And when you think about this, this is very much of an Eastern philosophy, almost like martial arts. The whole idea between martial arts, Bruce Lee and the 1 inch punch, and those types of things is that you move as little as you possibly can and have a disproportionate output. So Bruce Lee had this 1 inch punch, and his whole idea was that he channeled all the strength and energy really into doing this tiny little thing that would, if you ever watch videos of this and they're on Google, he would just literally knock people across the floor with this tiny little 1 inch punch. Well, it's the same kind of thing here with Ono. Ono was like, don't confuse activity with results. We're all about getting results. And so that means moving very little to get maximum output. You could extend this with all sorts of types of athletes. If you ever seen the pros serve a tennis ball, there's not a whole lot of movement involved, but that tennis ball really moves very powerfully once they hit it. I'm sure Shelby would tell us that, and Joel would tell us that golf is the same way. There's many other analogies toward this motion kind of idea. Moving along, transportation is another thing, redundant transportation. So transportation is necessary. It's not transportation that's a problem. It's the redundancy in an unnecessary transportation. So if we're moving an item, let's say we have a large warehouse and we have one station here that an item needs to go to, but then we have another station over here that it has to go to, and then another item station over here that it has to go to. Ono would eventually say, stop. This is unnecessary. If we know that this item most of the time has to go to this station, well, let's move this station up here. So it just travels that tiny little distance. And let's move this station over here. And let's get rid of all this waste here. Because if we're doing that repeatedly, it's what I call death by 1,000 cuts. You know, that distance doesn't seem that long, but if we're doing that 20 times a day, that time is adding up. And during that entire movement, we could be moving just that and then focusing on what we really want to do, which is quality production. Let's see what else we have here. So we also have over processing and overwork. So he would witness people kind of a lot of redundancy that was unnecessary. So one example is the idea that if I'm moving something through this production line and this person does something, and then here it goes through and this person checks what they did. So this person checks to see this first person work was done. And then let's say this person checks to see that person's work was done. So Ono would say, well, essentially we're doing everything twice. We're doing it once here, and then we're doing it again here if he's got to check it. And then, you know, if he's checking this person, we're doing it a second time there. And that's all unnecessary redundancy. Ono would say, why don't we just do it right the first time? So this person does it and they're responsible for it being done correctly. And we metric the station out so that they have the time to do that. But this person shouldn't have to be inspect their stuff. We should hold this person accountable for what they're supposed to do. Ono was a big believer in holding people accountable and getting after the root cause of the problem. And defects kind of goes hand in hand with that. if we have to have a quality control station down here because we have so many defective things coming through the system, Ono would say, as long as we have a quality control station here, we're letting these people off the hook and they're going to continue to produce defective items. If we get rid of this person and we push this stuff out to the customer, then we've got to deal with it because the customer's calling us up saying, hey, I have a defective item. So as long as we have a quality control person down here, this person is going to continue to make defective stuff because they know this person will catch it. It's kind of like I worked for a guy one time and he would redo everything that I did. I put packets together. It was an approval process. So I would put a packet together and then he would go ahead and, because it had to be signed off by a general, he would retype a lot of the stuff in it. And so I kind of did the opposite. Instead of putting my full effort into it, I put about half, I did it to about a 50% level because I said, why should I waste time with this? Because he's going to redo it all. So it's kind of the opposite of that. Probably not the best solution. And then inventory, Ono was actually a big opponent to inventory for the same reason, is because, let me just look real quick. So to draw an example of this, let me just do this real quick. Ono was not a big fan of inventory. Remember, lean can really only be effective under conditions of certainty. So Ono kind of saw inventory again as letting people off the hook because it would mask things. And so this is a really famous analogy he would make. He'd say inventory is kind of like a sea level. And if I have that inventory level high enough, it's going to mask all these problems that are down here underneath. Well, what might one of these problems be? Well, one of these problems might be defects. Okay, so let's assume this is, let's say I work in a bicycle factory and I have an inventory of finished bicycles on hand, finished goods. Okay, and let's suppose that Stone is one of our workers and he produces a defective bicycle. And Jesse is coming to pick up bicycles. And just before Jesse shows up, I inspect my shipment and I see that it has a defective bicycle in there. Well, I just replaced the defective bicycle with one out of inventory. Okay, so Jesse comes, he picks up the shipment and he moves out. Well, Stone gets off the hook. All right, because Jesse never saw that we had a defective bicycle. We kind of covered that. However, if my inventory is down here, we can't get by on that. Okay, because we don't have a bike to cover Stone's defective production. And so Stone is exposed. I'm not meaning to single out Stone, but whoever produced that defective bicycle is exposed. So they have to produce quality bicycles. So that goes away. Let's work the other end. Let's say that Nick is our supplier. So this right here, this rock that could be hidden, we'll call this supplier performance. And let's suppose that Nick is a supplier, okay, and Vicus is a manufacturer. So Vicus is counting on Nick to show up at a certain time with raw materials so that Vicus can begin production. Vicus produces golf balls. All right. And so Vicus has all his crew all ready to go. And Nick decides he wants to stop and get a hamburger. And so he's late. Well, if Vicus has a high level of raw materials that he needs to produce that golf ball, Nick gets off the hook because Vicus just pulls out a raw material and he can begin production. Okay. But Ono would say, you're letting Nick get off the hook. And Ono would say, I want you to drop that level of raw materials and let's see what happens. Well, Nick's irregular performance would be exposed. And now he can't hide. Now we say, Nick, what is causing your performance to be irregular and not certain? And eventually, either Nick corrects his performance or we get a new supplier, that kind of thing. And you might say, well, wait a minute, what about all that stuff we learned about uncertainty and risk hedging and those kind of things? It's still true. Lean would not work in those types of environments. Okay. But Ono, would say, hey, generally, and he's quoted as saying, inventory is evil because if we keep these levels high, we'll never get after the root cause of all of our problems down here. So this graphic is actually pretty famous within lean philosophy and inventory in itself. Okay. Ono would say if you keep your inventory levels low, Ono didn't necessarily say, hey, inventory's got to go away entirely, but it's unnecessary. If it's unnecessarily high, you're never going to solve all this stuff down here. Another cause of problems could be a machine. Let's say you have you have a machine in your production process that keeps breaking down. Well, and you just say, well, we have another machine over here, or we have finished goods inventory to offset what that machine can't produce. Ono would say, stop doing that. Stop masking the problem with inventory, fix the machine, replace the machine, because this here adds up. It's wasteful. So that was Ono's philosophy on inventory. Okay, moving on to these other aspects of lean. Another idea behind, I don't know how that stuff got there. Another aspect of lean is maintaining a broad view. So staying focused on the customer, and I have in here italics, optimizing the whole thing, not just the part. So let me give you an example of something I dealt with back in, I want to say it was 2007, really at the height of the war. So out here in South Carolina, I believe it was, we had an airport, and a big commodity at the time was add-on armor kits for all the ground troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these armor kits, you could put add-on armor doors on Jeeps and Humvees and other kind of things like that. And so these kits were being produced at probably 10 different locations across the United States. So some kind of project manager here was shipping them down to the airport. Another one over here was shipping them down. Another one over here was shipping them down. And they were all coming in at different rates. Well, every time they would come in, it would overwhelm the airport. And so what the airport would do, and they wouldn't see these things coming. They didn't have any visibility. So these kits would just show up. They were big, bulky, oversized, and they couldn't move them on military aircraft would come in here every now and then, but what they would do is they would purchase commercial aircraft at the last minute to clear out their holding yard. And so they would do that, and that would optimize the airport because they didn't want to accumulate holding time. But it was also very, very expensive to do. And they didn't really care that it was expensive to do. But where I worked, which was United States Transportation Command, I mean, someone's got to pay that bill. So they would send the bill to these folks. Well, we saw that this didn't really make a whole lot of sense. And I'm not just telling a, hey, this is about me story. I was on a team of 5 folks, and the credit was not mine for coming up with this. One of the guys said, hey, we have the Defense Logistics Agency, which actually is up the road in Camp Hill. I had no idea that I'd be living that close to this place now. And he coordinated so that instead of this routing here, he said, let's make all that go here. And because under the black, it was all coming in different configurations. So in theory, every time it came in here, it looked differently. And these folks had to react to get a different plane to move it out. He said, okay, if we move it all in here, we can standardize the size configuration. That's one thing. And then number two, we can give these folks a heads up. And so they don't have to spend as much money. They still have to spend some money, but not as much to move it out. So in that case, we still provided value to the customer and we optimized the entire supply chain, not just this one part. The follow on from that too was eventually we took a look at how much was flying into Iraq, and we were able to take some of this out and put it on a boat because it was flying into Iraq at such a rate that they couldn't move it throughout Iraq. And so it was getting bottlenecked within Iraq. By putting it on a boat, it slowed down the flow a little bit, but also did it at much cheaper. Okay. And it doesn't, it doesn't sound, well, hey, you're slowing down the flow of add-on armor to the warfighter. That doesn't sound attractive. But the truth is they couldn't move it. And, they had more than what they needed. And at the same time, money is not infinite, even when you're fighting a war. As it was, I think, at that time, the Department of Defense and, of course, the United States was spending probably, I think, $1 billion a week to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that's a lot of money. So saving money where we can without compromising what we're trying to do is a good thing. But this is an example of optimizing the entire supply chain, not just part of it, while still staying focused on the customer. Going on to a little bit of a simpler example is the idea of simplicity. So reducing the touch points in a process. And you might say, hey, on the example you just talked about, you added touch points in. And, you could say, sure, we did, but it actually simplified the process too. Here we're talking about eliminating unnecessary steps. So the tiny example I have of this is the times that I used to go to the YCP Starbucks and I would hand them this mug that's on the screen and tell them I wanted black coffee. And there were actually times when they felt the need to tape a tag on my mug and write my name on it. So this is kind of like artist rendition, recreation. And I asked him, actually, Dr. Greisler was with me, and he asked them why they would do that. And the first answer was, well, we can't write on the mug. And he said, but why do you need to do that at all? And they said, well, that's our procedure. So and what made it even kind of sillier was they would put this tag on it and then they would walk it down to the end of the counter instead of handing it back to me. So that they don't do that anymore. And I don't know if it's because we talked to them about it that day or probably not. It was something else, but it was kind of a process they had that they were locked into that didn't really make sense in every situation. So that's the thing about lean, is looking at processes and thinking about where do we have unnecessary steps, unnecessary touch points where either the product has to go through that it doesn't need to, or if we're in the service industry where a person has to go through something that they don't necessarily need to do. In terms of the continuous improvement side of things, Kaizen is the Japanese word for continuous improvements. And so it's really a overarching philosophy of how can we continue to make things better, big or small. And actually it's the latter, it's the small changes, not for the sake of making change, but for the sake of making improvement. And so this is an old example where I tried color coding back when I was with you in person. You might have seen me color code the board. Well, there was a time when I would write on the board, at least the map check and stuff for the day, I would do it all in black. And one day it occurred to me that after a point, all that black probably appeared to you all as just noise on the board. And I thought, well, how can I make it less noisy and more so you can say, okay, I'm really concerned about stuff that's due, so I'll look for the red. I really am concerned about stuff that's coming up. So I'll look for the map check and the stuff that is blue and so on and so forth. So that's an example of a small improvement that, you know, that's the idea is the opposite of the death by 1,000 cuts. You want to continue to look for the small improvements, and the idea of just making that 1% improvement every day. And then over a week or a month, you've improved 7%, or I don't know if you can improve 30% of a month, but if you continually look for the small improvements, you accumulate significant improvements over time. And that's the lean philosophy, is that there's always something that you could improve upon. Two more points. One is the idea of visibility. So you'll see, if you poke around on the internet on lean, you'll see this thing called the 5 S's, which I don't have on the slide because I think it's more doing it than memorizing it. 5 S's is sort, segregate, simplify, shine, and some other things. But it's the idea, and if you Google 5S projects, you'll find just almost endless 5S projects implemented throughout industry, production, operations, those kind of things. And so the idea is getting all your kit, getting your operations, so everything has its place. And if it's not there, you can identify that there's a problem, and so that you can have this structure to your process. So here's just a couple examples. Again, in my prior life in the military, every unit in the Army has a motor pool with a safety board. And so the beautiful thing about a safety board is that it tells you where everything goes, and it really lends itself out to some quick inspection, where if there was an item, for example, if this safety hook wasn't up on the board, you'd see it right away. You'd see that it was missing. And so you could, hey, where's the safety hook? Who's got it? Are they using it? Why isn't it back up on the board? You could also inspect really quick. You could, excuse me, you can pull out this first aid kit. You can crack it open. You can see if all the stuff in there is has not met its expiration date, or if it has. But it's just a very simple way of cleaning up a project. And you could do this with a home garage, a basement, all these kind of things. And on that note, this is an old garage that, in fact, the last place that I lived, not where we're currently, but I do a lot of working out in the garage. I know I don't look like it, but we had a pegboard that the other people had left when they moved out. So instead of hanging up tools, I hung up a bunch of resistance bands, a belt, and some other things. And I found that the more I hung these things up, the more I used them. Imagine that. So visibility is just the idea that everything has its place, and it makes it easier to monitor a process and to see problems and to inspect the process. And then finally, I like the analogies with working out, but the idea of flexibility and multifunctionality. And right off the bat, this should not be confused with redundancy. Okay, so those are not the same thing. So again, I want everybody to think about production. And so this is really one big analogy. It's not that Ono was a fitness nut or anything like that. I really don't know. He lived to be pretty old, so he was in great shape one way or another. But the idea is having multifunctional items, machines that can do more than one thing, as opposed to having a whole bunch of things that are one-trick ponies. So here on the right side of the slide, we have all sorts of functional items. We have a pull-up bar, and you can do variations of pull-ups on that. You can do a few other things, but you need more equipment to do it. But generally, all you can do on there is pull-ups and maybe some ab exercise kind of things. Here we got a weightlifting bench. You pretty much can do variations of a bench press, and that's about it. You got one of those old school kind of weird squat racks. You're pretty much confined to doing squats on that, maybe some deadlifts from the hang and some other kind of things, but a limited amount of things. This hold plates. That's it. That's all that does, is hold weight plates. This is called a landmine, and you can do a couple things on that. And this is a bar holder. To beat the dead horse, when you got the power rack, you have a multifunctional kit. You can do all of these things on the power rack, and then you can do a whole bunch of other things. And so the analogy there is this is very much the Ono approach is, hey, let's get the machine where we can do 25 different things so that we can constantly switch. And that rapid switching enables us to do those small lots of production as opposed to big, massive ones. And it makes us a lot more flexible. It's going to help us reduce waste, and we're going to be a lot more effective. Another small example, not really the bet, but I bet if Ono was around today, I bet he would be very much a proponent of moving from manual systems, that means written documents and things like that, to electronic systems. Because with electronic systems, I can share documents, I can repurpose them. Going online has really reinforced that to me. The more things are electronic, I can share them with you. I can post them in different places. If I have something written on a piece of paper, there's a limited amount of things I can do with that as opposed to what I can do with it if it's electronic. So flexibility, again, not to be confused with redundancy. Ono was very much against redundancy. So if I've worked in places, military being one, where we had a lot of redundancy. So for example, communications, we would have communications on, we would have 3 communications methods to back up a primary method communication, depending on what we're doing. Wow. So for example, we might have a radio form of communications, and then on behind that, we might have a manual mean of communications where we had runners and things like that. It's kind of a different setting, but if Ono was in a situation where he saw like they would have 2 drills, for example, and I think he would say something like, why do we have 2 drills? Well, sometimes the first drill malfunctions. And instead of saying, well, we should have a backup drill, he would say, we need to fix the drill so it doesn't malfunction anymore. And you can see it, having a backup pencil is not a big deal. But if I have a huge machine and I need another machine behind it in case the first machine fails, eventually I run out of space and I run out of the money necessary to maintain those machines. And that was Ono's whole idea and approach, was the more that you need to have redundancy in the process, the more your process is faulty and wasteful. And again, you're just incurring that cost, and you're compromising your value to the customer, because eventually you're going to get to the point where something's got to give. Either you're going to have to pass that cost off to the customer, or you're going to go out of business because you choose not to, but you're going to be at a loss. You're going to be operating at a loss. So a lot of stuff for today, really all underneath lean. If you think about production and you think about the overall purpose of lean, which is improving value to the customer while reducing waste, and preserving quality, and all the ways that you could do that, and that challenge, then you'll be better off to understand lean as a whole. And the quiz that you take next week will give you a few situations where you'll need to evaluate, how a lean approach might be able to help with that. So, questions on anything that I've talked about today, big or small? All right. No questions that I can see. So with that, that's all that I have for you today. I will hang out until you clear the call in case there's folks who have questions or other things they want to talk about. Otherwise, we'll see you on Wednesday. Have a great week.